In 1913, the newspapers could hardly believe it. Buried deep in the oil fields of former Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, on a patch of land no one thought was worth much, a fortune was suddenly born. And the owner of that land wasn't a railroad tycoon or a seasoned investor. It was an 11-year-old black girl named Sarah Rector. Her story spread across the country, from the Kansas City Star to national papers that echoed the news. Headlines called her the richest Negro girl in America. Some even claimed she was among the richest children in the world, all because beneath her neglected allotment, oil had been struck, and it was gushing fast. But before the headlines and the money, before the cars, the bank accounts, and the court petitions, there was something even more shocking at the heart of this story. Sarah Rector's family hadn't been rich. They hadn't been powerful, or even particularly lucky. They were freedmen, descendants of enslaved people once held by the Creek Nation. Their land, like many allotments given to freed families after emancipation, was thought to be worthless, dry, rocky, unfit for farming. So how did one of the poorest plots in former Indian Territory become a gateway to millions? And what happened when America realized that one of its youngest millionaires was black? Sarah's story begins long before the oil boom, with a law meant to divide, control, and supposedly civilize Native and freedmen families after slavery. And it reveals what happens when systemic injustice collides with unexpected fortune. Because as soon as the oil started to flow, so did something else: greed, politics, and the battle over who gets to own black wealth in America. To understand how Sarah Rector's name ended up on a deed to oil-rich land, we have to go back a few decades, back to the aftermath of the Civil War, and a policy that reshaped the American West. When slavery ended, freedom didn't come with stability, especially for the thousands of African Americans who had lived within Native nations: the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These people were known as freedmen, formerly enslaved individuals and their descendants who had been held by Native slave owners. After emancipation, treaties in 1866 forced these nations to grant freedmen citizenship and land rights. On paper, it sounded like justice. In reality, it marked the beginning of another kind of control. By the late 1800s, the federal government was pressuring tribes to dissolve communal land ownership. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, and later, the Creek Allotment Agreement of 1901, tribal lands were divided into individual parcels. 160 acres for each Creek citizen, including freedmen and their children. It was promoted as progress, but in practice, it fractured tribal society and opened millions of acres to white settlement. Every man, woman, and child on the tribal rolls received a parcel, but those parcels weren't equal. Native elites and white settlers often secured the fertile sections, while freedmen families, like the Rectors, were left with rocky, marginal land. One local official even dismissed these plots as worthless. Sarah Rector was born in 1902 near Taft, Oklahoma, a small, self-reliant black community within what was then Creek Nation. Her parents, Rose and Joseph Rector, were descendants of Creek freedmen, both listed on the Dawes rolls. They lived modestly, farming, taking small jobs, doing what they could to make ends meet. When Sarah was just an infant, she was allotted a piece of land as part of the Creek Nation settlement. 160 acres in the dusty countryside of Glen Pool, about 60 miles from Taft. It was rough terrain, red clay, poor soil, almost no access to water. To most people, it had little or no value. In fact, her father once petitioned the county to sell the land just to cover its taxes, describing it as nearly impossible to farm. But beneath that red earth lay something no one could see yet: oil. And that single plot, assigned almost as an afterthought to a baby girl, would one day change everything. By 1910, Sarah was 8 years old, and her family's worthless allotment had become a burden. The land couldn't be farmed. Taxes were due every year, and the Rectors, like many freedmen families, struggled to pay them. They petitioned the county to sell the land, but because Sarah was a minor, federal law required special permission. The judge refused, so Joseph Rector did what many desperate families did. He leased the land. A white oilman named B.B. Jones agreed to pay a small royalty to drill on the property. At the time, oil speculation in Oklahoma was like gambling: risky, uncertain, full of dry wells and false hope. The lease brought Sarah about $3 a day, barely enough to cover her taxes. Then, in late 1913, everything changed. Jones's crew hit a deep pocket of oil, one of the largest gushers ever recorded in the region. The Rector well, as it came to be called, began pumping out 2,500 barrels a day. Overnight, Sarah's royalty income jumped from $3 a day to over $300. That's nearly $10,000 a day in today's money. And that was just the beginning. News spread fast. A little black girl in Oklahoma, the daughter of freed slaves, was suddenly wealthier than most oilmen, bankers, or city officials. Her name became a national sensation. Newspapers called her the richest Negro girl in America. Some reports exaggerated her fortune into the millions. But even the verified sums were staggering. Sarah's monthly income exceeded the governor's salary. But the headlines didn't just marvel at her fortune. They questioned it. They questioned how a black child could legally own so much, and whether she was fit to manage it. Within weeks, local officials were demanding oversight. Bankers refused to deposit her checks unless a white guardian was appointed. And so began the second half of Sarah's story. The part where wealth became something she had to fight to control. By early 1914, Sarah Rector's name was everywhere. Papers from Kansas City to New York ran sensational headlines. Oil made Pickaninny rich. Millions for a Negro girl. The language dripped with fascination and racism, as if the very idea of a black child becoming wealthy was a violation of nature. Reporters traveled to Oklahoma hoping for a photograph, a quote, a glimpse of this so-called miracle child. But the Rector family was private, modest, and unprepared for fame. Sarah didn't give interviews. She didn't pose for the papers. She was still a student, trying to live a normal childhood, while America gawked at her balance sheet. Behind the headlines, a quieter but more dangerous battle was unfolding. White guardianship laws in Oklahoma gave courts the power to appoint white trustees for Native and black minors who came into money. It was justified as protection. In practice, it was exploitation. Countless children from freedmen families lost control of their oil leases this way. Their profits siphoned by court-appointed guardians, banks, and local power brokers. When officials discovered the size of Sarah's royalties, they declared her incompetent to handle her affairs, even though her only limitation was her age. A white man named T.J. Porter was assigned as her financial guardian. Suddenly, every check, every business decision, every expense had to go through him. Public outcry followed. Black leaders and newspapers raised alarms. Why should a child be punished for her wealth and her race? The Chicago Defender and the Crisis, the NAACP's publication, began covering her story as a civil rights issue. If white children could inherit fortunes without interference, why couldn't she? Booker T. Washington himself wrote to investigate, seeking assurance that Sarah's assets were secure and that she was being treated fairly. Others feared she would become yet another victim of systemic theft, a story all too familiar for Black families in the Jim Crow South. And in the middle of it all stood a quiet girl, barely 12. Her name now a lightning rod in a national debate about race, money, and control. As the frenzy grew, Sarah Rector became more than a child with oil money. She became a symbol of what could happen when the rigid social order of Jim Crow collided with something unpredictable: wealth. By 1914, Sarah's guardianship was under national watch. The Chicago Defender published alarming reports, claiming Sarah was being mistreated and exploited by her white guardian. Some stories even alleged she had gone missing, rumors that spread quickly and fueled public outrage. The NAACP, led by figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, intervened. They demanded an official investigation, reaching out to Oklahoma authorities and to Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute, urging him to ensure Sarah's safety and fair treatment. Washington responded immediately. He sent attorney J.E. Robinson to Oklahoma to verify the reports firsthand. What Robinson found was more complicated than the headline suggested. Sarah was safe. Her family still lived near Taft, but her financial freedom was another matter entirely. Under Oklahoma's guardianship system, Sarah technically owned her wealth, but she couldn't access it without white approval. Every withdrawal required a judge's signature. Even simple purchases, clothing, school expenses, home repairs, had to be itemized and approved by her guardian. Her own oil royalties were, in effect, locked behind courthouse doors. Still, Sarah's case forced change. Under pressure from activists and scrutiny from the press, officials eventually adjusted her legal status. By around age 12 or 13, she was declared legally competent, giving her greater control over her property and income. A rare victory in an era when Black ownership was routinely undermined. In the years that followed, Sarah Rector's fortune continued to grow. According to contemporary estimates, her oil wells produced more than $15,000 a month, making her one of the wealthiest African Americans in the country. And she was still barely a teenager. But with every headline and photograph, public curiosity deepened. What kind of life could a young Black millionaire live in the 1910s America? By her teenage years, Sarah Rector was no longer just a headline. She was a young woman, trying to build a future beyond the spectacle. With the national attention came opportunity, but also immense pressure. She had to learn how to manage her wealth, while still learning her multiplication tables. In 1916, Sarah and her family moved from Taft, Oklahoma, to Kansas City, Missouri, a thriving hub for Black business and culture. They purchased a grand 2.5-story brick home at 2000 East 12th Street in a growing middle-class neighborhood. It was a statement of progress and pride. The house was filled with fine furniture, electric lighting, and even an automobile, luxuries few Black families of the time could afford. She enrolled in the Lincoln Institute in Jefferson City, Missouri, a prestigious school founded in 1866 by Black Union soldiers to educate freed slaves and their descendants. It was there that Sarah began to find her footing, not as a curiosity, but as a student among peers. Education became her shield against exploitation, the key to managing what others had tried to control. By the time she turned 18, Sarah had full authority over her finances. She diversified her holdings, investing in real estate, stocks, and small business ventures. Her portfolio included land in Oklahoma, Missouri, and possibly Texas, as well as a boarding house and restaurant in Kansas City. Unlike so many stories of sudden wealth that ended in loss, hers was one of stability and caution. Her fortune didn't vanish with time, it evolved. But Sarah's adulthood wasn't lived in the public eye. She had learned from experience that privacy was power. The girl who once made national headlines became a woman who chose quiet success over spectacle. She lived comfortably, married Kenneth Campbell in 1920, raised 3 sons, and remained active in her Kansas City community, all without seeking fame or recognition. Yet her very existence continued to challenge expectations. At a time when laws and customs tried to deny Black prosperity, Sarah Rector embodied the impossible. A Black woman who had inherited wealth, grown it, and refused to be defined by it. By the time Sarah Rector passed away in 1967, the world had changed beyond recognition. She had lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. Decades later, her story still echoes in conversations about generational wealth, financial literacy, and systemic inequality. Her victory, though personal, points to a collective truth. Access to ownership, land, investment, enterprise changes everything. Today, her story reminds us that wealth, whether earned or inherited, is never just about money. It's about the freedom to decide your own path. And that, more than the oil itself, was the true treasure Sarah Rector claimed. Her life stands as both history and blueprint. A reminder that the tools of freedom aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they're written on a deed. And sometimes they're the oil buried beneath a little girl's forgotten field.